No shot lands that far, not in this storm, not from any woman alive. He said it laughing. The enemy's sniper boot pressed hard against a wounded American soldier's spine. The man face down in the snow groaning, keyed his radio and said it loud enough for his whole unit to hear. Then he fired 2 more rounds into the valley below. Not to kill, to remind, to humiliate. He scratched another mark into his rifle stock, slow and deliberate like a man savoring a meal. At 1,600 meters above the frozen valley controlling everything below him, he believed distance made him immortal. He had never been more wrong in his life. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The storm came without warning the way the worst ones always do. 1 hour, the sky above the valley was the color of pewter, cold flat and still. The next, it dropped like a ceiling collapsing, and the wind turned savage. Snow didn't fall so much as attack. It came sideways, it came in spirals, it came in sudden walls that turned a man standing 10 feet away into a ghost, then into nothing at all. Sergeant First Class Dale Whitmore had been in difficult terrain before. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and a training rotation in Norway that he still occasionally woke up from in cold sweats. But standing inside the half-buried stone field shelter in that frozen American valley, watching the temperature gauge read -23 and dropping, he felt something he rarely admitted to feeling. He felt trapped. Sarge, Private First Class Torres crouched beside him, his breath coming out in rapid clouds. Martinez is getting worse. His leg, I think something's broken in there. He keeps saying he's fine, but he can't put weight on it. Whitmore didn't look up from the map he was studying, not because the map was giving him answers. It wasn't. It was giving him the same answer it had given him for the past 11 hours, that they were in a bowl surrounded by high ridgelines, and the worst ridgeline of all was the northern one. The one at approximately 1,600 meters across the valley floor. What's his temperature? Whitmore asked. Core's holding, barely, but if we can't move him to the extraction point, we can't move anybody anywhere right now. Whitmore finally looked up. You understand that, Torres? Every time anyone steps outside the ridge lights us up. Garrison took a round yesterday that missed his ear by 4 inches. 4 inches? That's not suppression fire anymore. That's a sniper who knows exactly where we are and is playing with us. Torres swallowed. He was 22 years old and right now he looked younger. So what do we do? Whitmore folded the map. We wait for the call from command. And if the call doesn't come, Whitmore looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then we figure something else out. That was how he'd been raised in the Army. You always figured something else out. You never said there was no option. You said you hadn't found the right one yet. But sitting in that shelter with 9 other soldiers, 2 of them injured communications cycling in and out due to atmospheric jamming, and an enemy sniper on that ridge who had already demonstrated he could reach them with terrifying accuracy, Whitmore was starting to wonder if this was the situation where the rule finally broke. Specialist Aaron Gaines, who handled the radio and had a way of saying brutal things in a completely calm voice, spoke from the corner of the shelter without looking up from his equipment. Storms forecast to run another 18 to 24 hours. Winds going to stay above 40 knots in the valley. Visibility's sitting at maybe 180 meters right now and dropping. He paused. In case anyone was wondering. Nobody was wondering, Gaines, said Corporal Theo Ruiz, who was leaning against the stone wall with his rifle across his knees and his eyes closed. We all have eyes. Eyes don't tell you it's going to get worse before it gets better. Neither does your forecast if I throw your radio out into the snow. Gentlemen. Whitmore's voice was quiet but sharp. It cut through the shelter like a knife. Everyone went still. Save it. Silence came back. The wind outside screamed against the stones. Somewhere further down the shelter, Martinez made a sound that was half grunt and half something else, the sound a man makes when he's trying very hard not to let anyone know how much pain he's in. Whitmore pressed his back against the cold stone and closed his eyes for a moment. 11 hours. They'd been pinned down for 11 hours. In that time, 4 attempts to reposition had been met with immediate, precise suppression fire from the northern ridge. The enemy up there wasn't random militia. He was trained, patient, and he had the high ground in every possible sense of the word. He could see the entire valley. He controlled it completely. And in these conditions, blizzard winds atmospheric distortion, a valley geometry that turned every thermal and wind current into chaos, he was as close to untouchable as anyone Whitmore had ever faced. Because the math was simple and devastating, 1,600 meters in a blizzard at altitude with winds cycling unpredictably between 20 and 50 knots was not a shot that existed in practical doctrine. Even elite-level snipers operated at confirmed effective ranges that fell well short of what this engagement required. The physics of it alone bullet drop, exceeding 30 meters of flight path of over 2 full seconds through unstable air. The barrel itself affected by the cold, it was the kind of problem you put on a whiteboard in a training classroom and then stepped back and said, "Now, somebody tell me why this shot doesn't happen." And the answer every student gave was the same, because you can't control what you can't predict. That was the wall. That was why the enemy sniper on the ridge laughed. Not because he was cruel, though he might have been, but because the math was on his side and he knew it. Gaines's radio crackled. Everyone in the shelter moved without moving that particular stillness of 10 people trying not to breathe too loud because something important might be about to come through. The static cleared partially and the voice came through, fragmentary but recognizable as belonging to someone at command. "Whitmore, this is Henley. Do you copy?" Whitmore was already at the radio. "Copy, Henley. Go ahead. We're sending you an asset, ETA, approximately 40 minutes, weather permitting. Name is Carter, Staff Sergeant Emily Carter. She's going to assess your situation." Whitmore frowned at the radio. "Henley, with respect, we don't need an assessment. We need extraction or fire support. We have casualties." "I understand that. Carter is your fire support." A pause. Whitmore looked at Gaines, who raised an eyebrow a fraction of a millimeter. Whitmore looked back at the radio. "Say again, Mean." "Carter is your fire support. She's a long-range engagement specialist. Let her work. Henley out." The radio went back to static. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Ruiz opened his eyes. "Long-range engagement specialist," he repeated. He said it the way you repeat something when you're trying to decide if it's a joke. "In a blizzard." "Apparently," Gaines said, "against a target at 1,600 meters." "That would be the target, yes." Ruiz closed his eyes again. "Outstanding." Torres looked at Whitmore. "Sarge, is that actually a real thing? Someone who can—" "I don't know yet," Whitmore said honestly. "Let's wait and see what walks through that door." What walked through the door 41 minutes later was not what any of them expected. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter came in from the storm, the way competent people arrive at difficult situations, without theater, without preamble, and without any apparent interest in whether you were impressed by her entrance. She was medium height, built lean and functional in the way that long-distance runners are built, wearing cold weather gear that was slightly different from standard issue, in ways that Whitmore's trained eye noticed immediately: modifications, customizations, the kind of small adjustments that only happen when someone has been in enough extreme conditions to know exactly what fails and why. She carried a rifle case that was not standard anything, and she set it down against the wall with the practiced ease of someone who had done it in far worse conditions than this. She looked around the shelter once. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloging, assessing, not in a theatrical way, not slowly and dramatically, but in the rapid, comprehensive way that certain kinds of professionals look at spaces. Like a surgeon looking at a patient before they've said a word. Like a chess player looking at a board. Then she looked at Whitmore. "You're Whitmore," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. Northern Ridge. Fixed position. Far as we can tell, he's been there since before we were pinned and consistent firing solutions from the same general arc. We think he's got a primary position and at least one secondary." Carter nodded. She was already looking at the wall of the shelter as if she could see through it. "How long since last contact?" "Last round came in about 90 minutes ago. Before that, every time anyone stepped outside." "He's conserving," she said. "Not to anyone in particular. He knows the storm is doing his work for him. He doesn't need to shoot. He just needs to remind you he's there." She paused. "That's actually useful." Ruiz made a sound from his corner. It was not a friendly sound. Carter looked at him. Her expression didn't change. "You have something to say, Corporal?" Ruiz opened his eyes fully. He was not a small man, and he was not in the habit of softening his opinions. "I have a question," he said. "Command told us you're our fire support, against a target 1,600 meters out. In this, he gestured upward, indicating the storm that was currently trying to pull the stones of the shelter apart one at a time. Am I understanding that correctly? That's correct. Okay, Ruiz nodded slowly. I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is the only useful thing in a situation like this. That shot doesn't exist. Not in these conditions. Wind velocity cross currents in the valley, bullet drop at that range in this air density, barrel performance in sub-zero. I've been shooting for 11 years and I'm telling you as someone who takes the craft seriously that what you're describing is not a shot that lands. It's math, not opinion. The shelter was very quiet. Carter listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt him. When he finished, she said, "You're right about the difficulty. You're right about the variables. You're not right about the conclusion. With respect, Corporal, I didn't come here to debate ballistics with you. I came here to solve your problem." She looked back at Whitmore. "I need the highest ground inside this shelter that gives me a sight line to the northern ridge. I need your best read on the wind cycles from the last 12 hours. And I need someone who can time intervals without being asked twice." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who trusted his instincts about people, and his instincts right now were doing something complicated. She wasn't performing confidence. That was the thing. He'd seen performers, officers who walked into difficult rooms like they were already writing their memoirs. Carter wasn't doing that. She was asking operational questions in operational sequence, which meant she was already solving the problem, not introducing herself to it. "Gaines," Whitmore said. "Get her whatever she needs." Gaines stood without comment. Torres moved to help without being asked. Ruiz watched all of this with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He didn't say anything else, but his expression said it for him. This is going to fail. And when it does, we're going to be in exactly the same position we're in now, except we'll have made noise and told them we're still trying. Carter set up her rifle with the kind of deliberate, methodical precision that is only possible when someone has done it so many times that they no longer think about the steps, they simply do them. The rifle itself was extraordinary. Whitmore had been around long-range weapons his entire adult life, and he recognized immediately that this was not standard military issue. It was something else. Something built for specific purpose in a way that standard-issue weapons designed for versatility could never quite achieve. "Montana," Torres said suddenly. He'd been watching her hands and he blurted it out the way young people sometimes blurt things out when they make a connection. "Command said you were from Montana." Carter glanced at him briefly. "That's right. You grew up shooting in this kind of weather. I grew up shooting in weather that made this look like a spring afternoon." Torres almost smiled despite himself. Almost. Carter had pulled out a small notebook, actual paper, not digital, which Whitmore found interesting in itself and was running calculations in it. Pencil, fast, confident strokes, numbers and notations that she wasn't explaining to anyone because they weren't for anyone else. They were for her and for the problem. "Wind cycles," she said without looking up. "You've been here 12 hours. What did you observe about the rhythm of the gust?" Whitmore thought back. He'd been watching the storm because watching was something to do when you couldn't move and because understanding your environment was basic survival. Gusts come in hard for 3 to 4 minutes. Then there's a drop. Short, maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. Then it cycles back up. Consistent intervals. Roughly, storm's not perfectly rhythmic, but there's a pattern underneath the noise. Like the random stuff is layered over something more regular. Carter finally looked up from her notebook. For the first time since she'd walked in, something changed in her expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the particular look of someone who has just had a calculation confirmed. "That's exactly what it is," she said. "The valley has a thermal structure. Even in a blizzard this severe, the underlying atmospheric architecture stays relatively consistent. The storm is turbulent on top, but the base layer, the layer that determines sustained wind behavior in the valley geometry, follows predictable cycles." She looked at him steadily. "The storm didn't hide that pattern from you. You just found it." Whitmore stared at her. "You're saying there's a window." "I'm saying there's a series of windows. They're short, they're imprecise, but they exist and they repeat." She looked back at her notebook. "I need to watch 2 cycles to confirm timing. Then we establish the exact window." And then you take the shot, Torres said. And then I take the shot, Carter said. From his corner, Ruiz made a small sound. It was the sound of a man who has decided to stop arguing, but has not changed his mind. Whitmore didn't respond to it. Instead, he crouched down near Martinez, whose face in the dim light of the shelter was pale but steady. "How you doing?" Whitmore asked quietly. "Outstanding, Sergeant," Martinez said, which was a soldier's lie, and both of them knew it. "We're going to get you out." "I know." Martinez looked past him toward Carter, who was now positioned near the shelter's narrow observation gap, watching the valley with the focused stillness of someone listening to something no one else can hear. "She real?" he asked. "Seems like it. Because Ruiz is over there looking like he swallowed something he didn't enjoy. Ruiz has opinions about math." Martinez made a careful, controlled movement that might have been an attempt at a shrug. "Math's what got us into this. Maybe something else gets us out." Whitmore looked at him for a moment, then he stood. The next hour was one of the strangest hours Whitmore had ever spent in a military setting. Carter was almost completely still at her observation point. She wasn't talking, she wasn't fidgeting. She was watching the valley and the storm with the patience of someone who understood at a cellular level that the storm was a system, and systems had rules, and if you waited long enough and paid attention to the right things, the rules revealed themselves. Every soldier in the shelter dealt with it differently. Torres cleaned his rifle 3 times. Gaines cycled through radio frequencies looking for anything useful, finding mostly static. 2 of the other soldiers, Decker and Paulson, played cards with a battered deck that Paulson had been carrying for 2 tours. Nobody spoke much. Ruiz watched Carter. Not the way you watch someone you trust. The way you watch someone you're waiting to see fail. Not out of malice, Whitmore had known Ruiz long enough to know there wasn't malice in him, but out of the particular protection mechanism that experienced soldiers develop when hope is a resource being rationed. If you don't believe it can work, the failure doesn't break you. Whitmore understood that. He even respected it after a fashion, but he kept watching Carter. At the 53-minute mark, she wrote something final in her notebook and put it away. 40 minutes, she said. First window in approximately 40 minutes. Based on the last 2 cycles, the lull will last between 25 and 40 seconds. During that window, wind drops to laminar at valley floor level. Thermals flatten temporarily. That's the shot. 25 to 40 seconds, Ruiz said from his corner, and his voice was not unkind, just precise. To range confirm, calculate, final correction, and fire a round that needs 2+ seconds of flight time through air that even in your quote-unquote window is not going to be perfectly stable. "Correct," Carter said. "And 1 shot, potentially. We'll see what the first data gives us." Ruiz looked at Whitmore. "Sarge?" Whitmore held up a hand slightly, not to dismiss him, just to say, "I hear you. I'm watching." Carter was already beginning her final preparations. The rifle, the position, small adjustments, tiny angles. Her breathing had changed, not faster, not slower, but different, more deliberate, more spaced. Whitmore recognized it from shooters he'd trained with who had real discipline. She was managing her own physiology for precision. "Can I ask you something?" Torres said, and his voice came out smaller than he probably intended. Carter glanced at him. "Have you done something like this before? This distance, these conditions?" She held the look for a moment. Then she answered him honestly, the way you answer a young soldier who deserves the truth more than he deserves comfort. "Not exactly like this," she said, "but close enough that I know what the solution looks like. And if the first shot misses, then I learn from it," she said simply, "and I wait for the next window." Torres nodded. He looked at his hands. Then he looked back at her. "Okay," he said quietly, like he'd made a decision about something. Ruiz exhaled slowly from his corner. He unfolded his arms. He didn't say anything, but the unfolding was its own kind of statement. The 40 minutes passed the way time passes in extreme situations, in uneven chunks, some of them glacial and some of them pinning before they registered. And then Carter said, 90 seconds. Everyone in the shelter went still. Even Martinez stopped making the small, careful sounds he'd been making. Whitmore stood behind and to the side where he could see without interfering. Gaines had his eyes on his watch. Torres was very still against the wall, his lips pressed together. 60 seconds, Gaines said. The storm outside screamed. The stones around them vibrated. Carter was absolutely still. Her breathing was slow and controlled, and her eye was to the scope, and her finger was where it needed to be, And she was waiting, not anxiously, not desperately, but with the particular quality of patience that belongs only to people who have genuinely made peace with the outcome before it happens. 30 seconds, Gaines said. And then something shifted in the sound of the storm. It was subtle, barely detectable, but Whitmore caught it. A fraction of a reduction in the howl, a slight smoothing of the chaos, like a river that has been running white water suddenly finding a deeper channel. The lull, Carter fired. The sound of the shot in the confined space was enormous and immediate. And then it was gone, and there was only the storm and the silence inside the shelter, and the knowledge that a bullet was traveling through 1,600 meters of violent winter air, and no one was breathing. 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a very long time when you are waiting. And then the radio crackled. And then Gaines said in a voice that had no inflection at all, "No contact report, target not down." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was heavier. It had a specific quality of weight that pressed down on everything in the shelter. Outside, the ridge came alive. Counterfire. Fast, precisely directed 3 rounds that hit the stone exterior of the shelter in a stitched line that told everyone inside exactly what it meant. The enemy had used the muzzle flash to refine his own firing solution. He now knew exactly where they were within a margin of error that was becoming smaller by the shot. A grunt from the back of the shelter. "Paulson," Torres scrambled back. Paulson had taken a stone fragment. Not a direct hit, but the impact of a round on the exterior wall had sent debris flying, and a piece had caught him across the side of his neck. Not fatal, but bleeding, and adding to the casualty count that was already too high. "I'm okay," Paulson said with his hand pressed to his neck. "I'm okay." Ruiz was already moving to him, the practiced movement of a soldier who knows field medicine without thinking about it. Whitmore turned to Carter. She had not moved from her position. Her eye was still to the scope, but she wasn't looking at the ridge. She was looking at her notebook, which was open beside her, and she was writing. "Wind shifted at release," she said without being asked. It was the voice of a scientist noting an observation, not a soldier processing a failure. "Not the cycle I predicted. There's a secondary variation I didn't account for. There's turbulence at the 800-meter mark that's creating a lateral push I can correct for if I know the exact timing." "A man just got hurt," Ruiz said. His voice was controlled, but controlled in the way that things are controlled right before they stop being controlled. Carter looked at him. "I know. Because you took a shot that brought counterfire onto this position. I know that too. And you're writing in your notebook. Because the data from that shot is what makes the next shot possible." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't harden. It just said the thing. "I understand that it feels wrong. I understand why you're angry. Both of those things are true at the same time as the fact that if I don't process what just happened, the next window produces the same result." Ruiz stared at her. The muscles in his jaw were working. Whitmore stepped between them, not dramatically, not aggressively, just physically between them, because sometimes that's what a sergeant does. "Carter," he said. She looked at him. "How long until the next window?" She looked at her watch, then at her notebook, then back at her watch. "In 18 to 22 minutes, she said. Whitmore nodded. "Then we have 18 to 22 minutes. He looked at the men in the shelter, at Torres helping Paulson hold pressure on his neck, at Gaines back at his radio, at Martinez on the ground watching everything with his pale, steady face, at Ruiz, who was still standing with his jaw set and his eyes somewhere between fury and something older and more tired than fury. "Everyone stays calm," Whitmore said. "Everyone stays ready. And nobody starts celebrating or panicking until this is done. Are we clear?" A murmur of assent moved through the shelter. Ruiz turned away. He went back to his corner. He didn't sit down this time. He stood. And Carter turned back to her notebook and kept writing. And the storm kept screaming, and the ridge stayed silent for now. But not for long. And in that shelter, in that frozen valley with casualties on the ground, and the clock ticking toward another window that might be the last chance any of them got, every single person in that space understood at a level below words and below doctrine and below every confident thing they'd ever been trained to say about probabilities and mathematics and the hard limits of what was possible. They understood that the next 18 minutes were going to change everything, one way or another. 18 minutes. That was all they had. 18 minutes before the next window opened, and everything in that shelter either moved forward or collapsed completely. Carter didn't waste a second of it. She was back at her notebook before the last echo of counterfire had finished rattling through the stones. Her pencil moved fast, precise, without hesitation. Not the movement of someone guessing, the movement of someone who had already begun solving the next equation before the current one finished failing. Whitmore watched her from across the shelter. He didn't speak. He'd learned something in the last hour about Emily Carter. She processed best when the air around her was quiet, and the best thing he could do right now was give her that. Torres was different. Torres needed to move. He was pacing the length of the shelter in short, tight lines. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back, his hands opening and closing at his sides. He'd helped Paulson get pressure on the neck wound, confirmed it wasn't arterial, confirmed Paulson was going to be angry and uncomfortable but not dead. And now he had nothing to do with his hands and too much happening in his head, and the pacing was the only thing keeping it from spilling out. Torres, Whitmore said it quietly. Torres stopped. Sorry, Sarge. Don't apologize. Just sit. Torres sat. He looked at Carter, then he looked at the wall, then at Whitmore. She's still writing, he said in a voice that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. Yeah. After the shot missed and Paulson got hit, she's still just writing. That's how it works, Whitmore said. How what works? Whitmore thought about how to say it. When something this precise fails, the failure has information in it. She's not ignoring what happened to Paulson. She's trying to make sure it counts for something. Torres processed that. He pressed his back against the stone wall and pulled his knees up. Okay, he said, not fully convinced, but quieter. From the corner, Ruiz spoke without turning his head. 14 minutes. He'd taken over timekeeping from Gaines without being asked, which told Whitmore something important. Ruiz still didn't believe, but he was counting down anyway, which meant some part of him, the part that had been a soldier longer than it had been a skeptic, was still in the game. 14, Whitmore confirmed. Martinez, on the ground with his leg immobilized, had his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling of the shelter. He'd been quiet for a long time, long enough that Whitmore had checked on him twice just to confirm he was conscious. Sarge, Martinez said without moving his eyes. Whitmore moved to him. What do you need? Nothing. A pause. I was just thinking about something my grandfather used to say. Old man was a hunter. Deer mostly, but sometimes elk. He used to say the mountain doesn't care about your skill. It only respects your patience. Whitmore looked at him. I think she has it, Martinez said quietly. The patience. I've been watching her since she came in. She's not scared. She's not anxious. She's just waiting for the right thing to show itself. He shifted very slightly carefully. My grandfather would have liked her. Whitmore put a hand briefly on his shoulder. We're going to get you home. I know, Martinez said. I just wanted to say that out loud, in case. In case of what? In case the next 18 minutes don't go the way we're hoping. It was the kind of honesty that only came from pain and altitude, and too many hours with no good options. Whitmore didn't argue with it, he just nodded and stood. Carter looked up from her notebook. I need to tell you all something, she said. Her voice was level, and it was addressed to the whole shelter, which made everyone in it go quiet in the particular way that happens when the person speaking is not performing, but simply saying a true thing. The first shot gave me data I didn't have before. The wind at mid-valley around the 800-meter mark has a lateral component I underestimated. It's not in the standard atmospheric modeling for this valley geometry because it's caused by a specific interaction between the northern ridge's contour and the thermal layer below the storm. It's consistent, and now I know the correction. Ruiz turned from the wall, not all the way, just enough. You're saying you can account for it. I'm saying I did account for it, past tense. It's already in the correction. A silence, then Ruiz said, and his voice had shifted by a degree that only someone paying close attention would notice. What's your confidence level? Carter looked at him directly. High enough that I'm taking the shot, low enough that I'm not making you a promise. That was the right answer. Whitmore saw Ruiz register. It saw something in his posture change. Not softening, not collapsing, but recalibrating. Ruiz respected honesty about uncertainty more than he respected false confidence. Most experienced soldiers did. 11 minutes, Ruiz said. Gaines at his radio station suddenly went very still. Everyone noticed. In a confined space under pressure, stillness is as loud as a shout. What? Whitmore moved to him immediately. Gaines held up one finger, wait, and pressed the headset hard against his ear. His face was doing something complicated. His eyes moved, his lips pressed together. Then he pulled the headset down. Intercepted enemy communication, he said. Partial. Their signals bouncing in the storm, but I got enough. What did they say? Gaines looked at Carter, then at Whitmore. They know we have a shooter inside the shelter. They don't know who, but they're discussing the transmission was fragmentary, but it sounded like they're discussing changing the enemy's sniper's position. The shelter went absolutely rigid with attention. When Whitmore said, "That's what I couldn't get. Could be 20 minutes. Could be less." Carter was already moving back to her scope. "We don't wait for the full window," she said. "We move up the timeline." "The window isn't open yet," Torres said. "You said 18 to 22 minutes. I said that based on the previous 2 cycles. But cycles can compress under changing conditions. If the valley temperature drops another degree or 2, which it's been doing steadily, the thermal lull could arrive early." She was at her observation position now, idoscope notebook open beside her. "Gaines, watch the upper left quadrant of the ridge. Any movement, any shift in position, you call it immediately." "On it." "Torres, you're on time. Call every 60 seconds. Torres straightened. The pacing stopped completely. He had a job now. "Roger." "Ruiz," she didn't look at him. "You're going to hear the shot, and you're going to fight every instinct you have to call out what you see. Don't. Give me 5 seconds before you say anything. Let the bullet arrive." Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Then, understood. Whitmore stood in the center of it all and felt something he hadn't felt in 11 hours. He felt the situation shifting, not resolved, not safe, not even close to either of those things, but shifting. The way a door shifts when someone finally puts their shoulder against it in exactly the right place. 8 minutes, Torres said. The storm outside had not relented. If anything, the wind had increased in the upper registers. The howling was higher, more sustained. But beneath it, Whitmore was listening the way Carter had taught him to listen by example. Listening for the underlying structure, the bass rhythm below the noise. And he thought he wasn't sure, but he thought he could almost feel it. A subtle change in pressure. The faintest reduction in the lateral force of the wind against the stone exterior. "Carter," he said quietly. "I know," she said without moving her eye from the scope. "I feel it too. It might come early." "How early?" "Could be 5 minutes, could be 6. "Torres, call every 30 seconds now." "Yes, Sarge." Torres' voice was tight but steady. He was doing what he needed to do. 7:30. Martinez from the ground had closed his eyes. His lips were moving very slightly. Whitmore couldn't hear what he was saying. He decided it didn't matter. Whatever Martinez was saying, it was the right thing for this moment. Paulson, neck wound dressed, had his back against the wall and his rifle in his lap. He wasn't going anywhere with a neck wound in a blizzard, but he had his rifle, and the fact that he was holding it was its own statement. Decker and the others had gone completely still. The cards were gone. Everything unnecessary was gone. The shelter had distilled itself down to the only thing that mattered. 7 minutes, Torres said. Carter made a microscopic adjustment to her position. Not the scope herself, the angle of her shoulder, the placement of her trigger hand, the slow, controlled release of a breath that reduced her body's movement by a degree that was invisible to everyone watching, but was at this distance the difference between a hit and a miss. She wasn't rushing, even with the timeline compressing, even with the knowledge that the enemy sniper might be moving his position at this very moment. She was not rushing. Because rushing at this range, at this difficulty, was the one thing that made every other variable irrelevant. Rushing was the only guaranteed miss. Gaines said movement, upper left. Something shifted. The temperature in the shelter dropped by nothing measurable and everything emotional. Define shifted, Carter said, voice completely level. Not a person, equipment, something reflective moved, like he's adjusting his setup. He's repositioning, Whitmore said. Not yet, Carter said. Repositioning takes time. He's still there. He's just restless. A pause, which means he knows something is coming. 6:30, Torres said. The pressure change Whitmore had been feeling intensified. It was unmistakable now. A reduction in the storm's lateral force, slight but real, like the storm was taking a half breath before its next scream. Carter's breathing slowed. Not just slowed, it became architectural. Each inhale carefully measured, each exhale deliberate and controlled and longer than the inhale, bringing her heart rate down by will alone to a place where her hands were as steady as the stone she was lying against. 6 minutes, Torres said, and then Carter said very quietly, "It's coming now." Not 6 minutes from now. Now the lull was arriving early. The storm's voice dropped a quarter of an octave in the space of about 4 seconds. Not silent, not even close to silent, but the chaotic, turbulent upper register of the wind smoothed for just a moment into something almost laminar. "Carter," Whitmore started. "I know." Barely a whisper. The shelter was a held breath. And then she fired. The report was enormous and immediate, and then it was gone, and there was nothing but the storm and the silence inside the shelter, and the knowledge that the bullet was out there in the air, in the valley covering 1,600 meters through atmosphere that was imperfect and turbulent and alive with every variable that made this shot the thing that people said didn't exist. 1 second, nobody breathed. 2 seconds. Gaines had his binoculars up at the observation gap, hands steady, eyes fixed on the northern ridge. 2.5 seconds. And then Gaines said, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual flat affect, replaced by something rawer and more immediate. "He's down." Nobody moved. "Say again," Whitmore said. "The target is down." Gaines's voice cracked on the last word. "Just slightly. Just enough. I have visual confirmation. The enemy sniper is down. He is not moving." The silence that followed was different from every other silence in that shelter. Every previous silence had been heavy with fear or doubt, or the specific weight of a situation without a visible exit. This silence was something else entirely. It was the silence of people who have been living inside an impossibility and have just watched it become real. Torres made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a 22-year-old soldier makes when he has been holding himself together for 12 hours and something finally gives him permission to stop. Martinez on the ground opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling and breathed. Paulson pressed his free hand flat against the stone wall beside him, like he needed to confirm the stone was still there. Ruiz did not make a sound. Ruiz turned from his corner and looked at Carter. She had not moved from her position. Her eye was still to the scope because the shot confirmed was not the same as the situation resolved, and she knew that. But there was something in the line of her back, in the set of her shoulders that was different from 30 seconds ago. Not celebration, not relief exactly, just completion. The particular quality of a person who finished the thing they came to finish. Ruiz walked across the shelter. Not fast, not dramatic. He walked the 6 steps between his corner and her position, and he stood behind her, and he said in a voice that was low enough that only she and Whitmore could clearly hear it, "I was wrong." Carter lowered the rifle from her shoulder. She looked at him. "You were working the problem," Ruiz said. "I was protecting myself from the failure." "Those aren't the same thing." A beat. "I should have been helping you instead of counting reasons it wouldn't work." Carter looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You kept the time." "That's not—" "You kept the time," she said again. "Every interval, every countdown. You never stopped doing that, even when you thought it was useless." That mattered. She held his gaze. "We're square." Ruiz nodded, once, the kind of nod that closes a chapter. Whitmore was already at the radio. "Gaines, get me command." "Trying, Sarge, the jamming's still—" A burst of static. Wait, I've got a channel. Partial, but—" "Henley, this is Whitmore. The ridge position is neutralized. Confirmed kill at 1,600 meters. We have 2 casualties requiring medical extraction. Martinez lower extremity fracture, Paulson neck laceration. Neither life-threatening. Storm is cycling. We need an extraction window in the next 4 hours." The response was partial, fragmentary, but enough. Enough to hear the word confirmed. Enough to hear extraction team. Enough. Torres was sitting with his back against the wall and his face in his hands. Not crying, just stopped. Just allowing himself to be stopped for a moment, which was something he hadn't been able to do since this whole thing started. "Hey!" It was Carter's voice, and it was directed at him. He looked up. "You did good," she said. "I didn't do anything. You kept your head. In a situation where most people lose it, you kept yours." She met his eyes steadily. That's not nothing. That's actually most of it. Torres looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, and something in his face that had been very tight became slightly less so. Gaines was on the radio trading fragments of information with command, through the interference building the picture of what came next. His voice had its flat professional quality back, which was itself a form of information. Gaines's professionalism was how he expressed relief. Paulson had his eyes closed and his head back against the stone, and a very slight smile on his face that suggested he was visiting somewhere warmer in his imagination and had decided to stay there for a few minutes. Decker said, "Someone want to tell me what just happened, because I was watching from over here, and I still don't entirely believe it." "What happened?" Ruiz said, and his voice had something new in it, not quite warmth, but the distant relative of warmth, "is that a woman from Montana just solved a math problem that the rest of us had decided was unsolvable." Decker looked at Carter. "That's really what happened." "That's really what happened," Ruiz said. "A beat." "Montana," Decker said, as if filing it for future reference. "Okay," Martinez laughed. It was painful. He immediately made a sound that indicated laughing with a broken leg was not something he'd recommend, but he laughed. And once he started, Torres did too, and then it moved through the shelter like something contagious, not loud and not long, but real. The kind of laughter that comes not from something funny, but from something finally breaking that needed to break. Carter allowed herself a small private smile. She was checking her rifle, cycling through the post-shot protocols that responsible shooters never skip, regardless of the outcome, because discipline is not something you turn on and off based on whether the news is good. But the smile was there, small and real and entirely her own. Whitmore watched all of it. He'd been a sergeant for 15 years. He'd seen units fall apart and units hold together, and every variation in between. He knew the difference between a group of soldiers and a team, and he knew that the difference was almost never about training levels or equipment or tactical plans. It was about moments, the specific moments when something impossible became possible, and everyone in the room witnessed it together, and the witnessing changed them. This was one of those moments. He could already see it happening, the way Ruiz was standing differently, the way Torres had stopped pacing, the way even Gaines, who expressed almost nothing, had a slightly different quality to his voice when he spoke into the radio. They had been a group of soldiers trying to survive. Now they were something that had been through the same fire together and come out the other side. That was worth something. That was worth something that no official report would fully capture. "Carter," Whitmore said. She looked up from the rifle. "Command's going to want a full account of the engagement. Distance, conditions, correction, factors, everything." "I'll write it up." "Will it be accurate?" She considered the question. "It'll be complete. Whether it's accurate depends on whether the people reading it are willing to believe that the variables I accounted for can actually be accounted for. Some of them won't be. I know." A beat. "That's okay. The shot is confirmed either way. The math doesn't need their belief." Whitmore nodded slowly. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." Outside, the storm continued. The ridge stayed silent. The valley, which had been a killing ground for 12 hours, was now just a valley, cold and brutal, and indifferent the way geography always is. It didn't know what had happened. It didn't care. It would be the same valley tomorrow and the same valley 20 years from now. But the people inside the shelter would not be the same people. They were 4 hours from extraction, 4 hours from warm food and medical treatment, and the long process of writing reports and giving statements and eventually sleeping somewhere that wasn't a half-buried stone field shelter with a storm trying to get inside. 4 hours was a long time, and the storm wasn't done yet. And none of this was over in the way that things are clean and final and tied off. But Whitmore had been a soldier long enough to know when the weight of a situation lifted, not disappeared, not resolved into ease and safety, just lifted slightly, just enough, the way a sky lifts after the worst of a storm has passed, even while the rain is still falling. He sat down. For the first time in 11 hours, he sat down. And he looked at the woman who had just done what everyone in the room had agreed was impossible, who was now quietly, methodically cleaning her rifle with the same precise attention she'd given to every other part of this. And he thought about what Martinez's grandfather had said. "The mountain doesn't care about your skill. It only respects your patience." He thought that was half of it. The other half, the half that the old man maybe knew but didn't say, was that patience without skill was just waiting, and skill without patience was just noise. The thing that Carter had, the thing that had changed everything in the shelter, was the specific and rare combination of both the technical capability to solve an almost unsolvable problem in the psychological discipline to wait until the problem was ready to be solved. That combination didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere, from Montana winters and years of practice and a specific kind of willingness to sit with impossibility without flinching until it showed you its door. Whitmore didn't know Carter's full story. He knew fragments, the Montana background, the classified designation, the phrase extreme distance engagements under experimental conditions that command had used and that covered, he suspected, a great deal more than it revealed. He would probably never know the full story, but he knew this when the mountain finally showed her the door. She walked through it, and 10 soldiers were going home because of it. That was the only story that mattered tonight. 4 hours felt like a different kind of waiting. Not the waiting of before that particular suffocating pressure of being pinned down with no exit, where every minute had the weight of a stone being added to a pile that was already too heavy. This waiting had air in it. It was still cold, still dangerous, still a long way from over. But something fundamental had shifted in the shelter, and everyone in it could feel it in their bones, even if none of them would have said it out loud. The ridge was silent, and silence from that ridge meant something entirely different now than it had meant 12 hours ago. Whitmore checked his watch. 14 minutes since the confirmed kill. 14 minutes since Gaines had said those two words, "He's down," and the shelter had done that thing shelters do when pressure releases suddenly, when the air itself seems to change composition. "Extraction window," Gaines said, pulling one side of his headset back. "Command confirmed a team is staged 12 kilometers south. They're waiting on a weather break in the access corridor. Could be 2 hours, could be 4. "What's their read on the corridor?" Whitmore asked. "Storm's weakening from the south. Corridor should open. They said probably." Gaines put the headset back. "Command's word, not mine." "Probably," Ruiz repeated from his corner, and the word had a dry quality to it that under different circumstances might have been funny. "It's better than definitely not," Torres offered. "That's a low bar, Torres." "It's the bar we have, Ruiz." Whitmore let them talk. The banter had a different texture now. It was still tense, still edged, but underneath this tension, there was something loose and human that hadn't been there before. The difference between men holding themselves together against a wall and men who had remembered they were allowed to be people. Carter was at the observation gap, still watching the ridge, still doing the thing she did, looking, waiting, reading the environment with that particular quality of attention that wasn't dramatic and wasn't performed, just completely real. Whitmore had started to recognize it as her natural state, not vigilance in the anxious sense. More like a sustained conversation with the world around her, listening for the next thing it needed to tell her. "You think they'll come back at us?" Torres asked her. He'd moved closer to her position without quite realizing it, the way people drift toward the person they've decided to trust. "Not the same way," Carter said, without taking her eye from the gap. "Losing their sniper changes their tactical picture entirely. That position was built around the assumption that they had a guaranteed eye on everything in this valley. Without it, they're exposed too. They know we have a confirmed long-range shooter in here now." A pause. "That changes the math for them the same way it changed it for us." Torres thought about that. "So we basically terrified them. We removed their certainty. That's the same thing." Ruiz made a sound that was almost not quite, but almost a laugh. 22 minutes after the confirmed kill, Gaines went rigid, not subtle, not the careful professional stillness he usually deployed. He went rigid in the way that means the radio has said something unexpected. And the something unexpected is significant enough that the body reacts before the brain finishes processing it. "Gaines." Whitmore crossed the shelter in 3 steps. Gaines pulled the headset down. His face was doing something careful, the face of a man constructing his delivery before he opens his mouth. "Command has additional intel from aerial reconnaissance. Drone overflight, limited visibility, but enough to get thermal imaging on the ridge." And Gaines looked at Carter, then back at Whitmore. There wasn't one sniper. The shelter went very still. "There were 2, Gaines said. Primary and secondary offset positions about 40 meters apart on the ridge. The shot hit the primary." He stopped. "And the secondary mile?" Whitmore's voice was level in the way that sergeants' voices get level when the situation requires it and the feelings have to wait. Still active, he's repositioned, moved further along the ridge to a new angle. Gaines put the headset back on briefly, then pulled it down again. Command believes he now has a firing solution on the eastern approach, the extraction route. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Martinez from the ground said quietly, "So we're not done." "No," Whitmore said, "we're not done." Torres looked at Carter. The look had a question in it that he didn't put into words because he didn't need to. Carter was already at her notebook. "Where exactly on the ridge?" she said. Not panicked, not even surprised really, just recalibrating. The way a surgeon who encounters an unexpected complication doesn't stop, they adjust. Thermal imaging puts him approximately 60 meters northeast of the primary position, Gaines said. Elevation slightly lower, different angle on the valley. Different atmospheric profile, Carter said half to herself, pencil already moving. The northeast section of the ridge has a different wind interaction with the valley geometry. The thermal lull cycle will be different there. She was writing fast. Not completely different. Related. But I need to recalculate. How long, Whitmore asked. 20 minutes to have high confidence, 10 minutes to have working confidence. What's the difference? Carter looked up. High confidence means I'm almost certain the correction is right. Working confidence means I'm fairly certain, but I'm accepting more risk in the variables. She held his gaze steadily. Your call, Sergeant. Whitmore looked at her. He thought about Martinez on the ground and Paulson with his neck wound, and 8 other soldiers who needed to walk out of this valley alive. He thought about an extraction team staged 12 kilometers south, waiting on a weather corridor, coming in on an eastern approach, that now had a second enemy sniper looking straight down at it. Working confidence, he said, we don't have 20 minutes to burn. Carter nodded and went back to the notebook. The next 10 minutes were among the most intense Whitmore had ever experienced, and he had experienced a considerable range of environments. The shelter felt like a closed fist, everything compressed, everything tightened, every person in it running their own version of the calculation. Ruiz had moved from his corner to a position where he could see both Carter and the observation gap, which meant he'd made a decision about where he was most useful. Torres was on time again, without being told back to 30-second intervals, his voice steady and quiet. Gaines was working 2 frequencies simultaneously, one ear on command, one eye on his notes. At the 8-minute mark, something happened that nobody expected. The radio, not Gaines's primary frequency, but his secondary, the one he kept open for anything that might come through, produced a voice. Clear, startlingly clear, given the jamming conditions. Speaking English with a heavy accent and very deliberate enunciation like someone who had prepared the words carefully and wanted them understood. American soldiers in the valley, I know you can hear this. You killed my partner. I want you to know I will not leave this ridge until every one of you is dead, or I am. This is not a mission for me anymore. This is personal. The shelter was a held breath. Gaines looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at Carter. Carter had not looked up from her notebook. He's broadcasting on an open frequency, Gaines said quietly. That's deliberate. He wants us to know. He's angry, Torres said. And then with a perception that surprised Whitmore slightly, he's also scared. Angry and scared is different from just angry. How is that different? Decker asked. Because scared people make mistakes, Torres said. Angry people are predictable. Scared and angry people do things they didn't plan to do. Ruiz looked at Torres with an expression that contained something that might, under closer examination, have been respect. When did you get smart? I've always been smart, Torres said. You just weren't listening. Carter looked up from her notebook for the first time since the transmission. She looked at Whitmore. He just told us something important. His emotional state, Whitmore said. More than that, he's broadcasting, which means he wants a response, which means he's waiting for something from us. He wants acknowledgement. He wants fear. He wants us to react. She set the pencil down. He's not in a purely tactical mindset anymore. He's in a reactive one. He's going to hold his position longer than a purely tactical operator would, because moving would feel like retreat, and right now retreat is the one thing his psychology won't allow. The shelter absorbed this. He's going to stay on the ridge, Whitmore said slowly. He's going to stay exactly where he is and wait for a target, Carter said, which means his position is fixed. Fixed is solvable. A beat of silence. Then Ruiz said, "You've been doing this long enough to read them that way, from a radio transmission." "I've been doing this long enough to know that when someone tells you they're not leaving, they're usually telling the truth," Carter said. "People lie about a lot of things. They almost never lie about their own stubbornness." 9 minutes, Torres said quietly. Carter picked up her pencil. 7 minutes from now, I need the observation gap clear, and I need everyone not involved in the shot to move to the western wall. The secondary position has a slightly different angle on the interior. If he responds with counterfire, the eastern side of the shelter takes the initial impact. People moved, not in a panic, in the efficient, practiced way of soldiers who have been given a clear instruction by someone they have decided to trust. The western wall filled up with bodies arranging themselves with careful economy. Martinez couldn't move. Whitmore went to him. "I'm going to shift you," Whitmore said. "I know. Do it." It wasn't pleasant. Martinez had a fractured leg and a makeshift splint, and moving him even a meter required both of them to work through the pain. Together, Martinez absorbing it, Whitmore managing it, both of them communicating through clenched teeth and careful hands until Martinez was repositioned against the western wall with the others. "Okay," Martinez said, and his voice was tight and controlled and honest. "Okay, I'm good." "You're not good," Whitmore said, "but you're positioned." "Same thing right now." Carter was at her final position. The rifle, the scope, the notebook open one last time to the page of corrections she'd built in 9 minutes of intense calculation. She looked at it for 10 full seconds, committing it to memory, and then she closed the notebook and set it aside. Because the shot itself was not a math problem anymore. The math was done. The shot was something else. It was the moment where preparation met execution, and every variable that had been computed and corrected and accounted for either held together or didn't, and the only way to know was to fire. 6 minutes, Torres said. Gaines was watching the thermal imaging feed that Command was transmitting, in fragments through the partial channel. Low resolution, fragmentary, but enough to confirm the secondary sniper's position on the northeast section of the ridge. "He hasn't moved," Gaines said. "Exactly where Command said. Thermal's consistent." "He won't move," Carter said. "You sure?" "He told us he wouldn't." She settled into her position, making the micro adjustments that were becoming familiar to everyone in the shelter. The shoulder, the trigger hand, the breathing that shifted from normal into something more architectural and deliberate. People who tell you they're not leaving generally need to prove it to themselves more than they need to prove it to you. 4 minutes, Torres said. The storm outside was doing something slightly different than it had been doing an hour ago. Still violent, still loud, still entirely capable of swallowing a bullet whole if the conditions weren't right. But the structure of it, the underlying rhythm that Carter had identified and that Whitmore had learned to feel, was there. Present, predictable in its own imperfect way. Ruiz was standing beside the observation gap, not blocking it, just near it, his eyes moving between the ridge and Carter with the focused attention of a man who is fully committed to the outcome he previously doubted. "Carter," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "Yeah. The northeast position, the wind interaction you mentioned. Is it going to give you a longer window or shorter?" "Shorter. The thermal structure on that section of the ridge is less sheltered. The lull will be real, but it'll be maybe 15 to 20 seconds instead of 25 to 40. "That's tight." "Yes. A beat. You've done tight before." She was quiet for a moment, then tighter. Ruiz nodded once. He looked back at the ridge. 3 minutes, Torres said, and his voice had settled into something that was not calm exactly, but was the closest thing to calm that a 22-year-old in a blizzard with a broken leg comrade and a second enemy sniper on a ridge could reasonably produce. It was the voice of someone who has decided to be exactly as useful as the situation requires and nothing less. Whitmore stood in the center of the shelter, the only person not against the western wall, not at the observation gap, not behind a rifle. Standing in the open space, which was his job. Holding the space together, which was his job. Being the point that everything else organized around, which had always been his job, since the first day someone put sergeant stripes on his sleeve and told him that the men around him needed someone to orbit. He was thinking about the extraction team in the quarter, 2 hours, possibly 4, coming in on the eastern approach that the secondary sniper had locked onto, coming in with medics and warm gear, and the means to get Martinez and Paulson the treatment they needed. Coming in completely unaware, in all likelihood, that there was a second shooter who had promised he wasn't leaving. The shot had to land, not because of anything abstract, not because of doctrine or records or what anyone would write in a report afterward, because an extraction team was going to come through that corridor, and if the ridge wasn't clear, they were going to drive into the same kind of fire that had pinned this unit down for 12 hours, and they weren't going to be ready for it. 2 minutes, Torres said. Carter's breathing had reached the place it needed to be. Whitmore couldn't hear it. She was too disciplined for that, but he could see it in the quality of her stillness. The way she had become somehow more still than the stone around her, more still than the air inside the shelter. As if she had found the eye of a storm that existed only inside herself. 90 seconds, Torres said. Gaines' thermal still shows him stationary. He's waiting. So are we, Ruiz said quietly. The enemy sniper's voice had stopped broadcasting. 15 minutes of silence from the radio since that transmission, the one where he'd promised he wasn't leaving, where he'd told 10 American soldiers in a half-buried stone shelter that this was personal now. The silence was its own kind of pressure, not knowing whether he was still transmitting on another frequency. Not knowing what he was thinking, only what he'd said he was going to do. He was waiting for a target. He was going to get something else entirely. 60 seconds, Torres said, and then, and this was the thing Whitmore would remember most clearly, later the detail that came back to him in the quiet of ordinary life, long after the valley was just a memory, Martinez spoke from the western wall. His voice was quiet and steady, and he addressed it to no one in particular, or maybe to all of them, or maybe just to the air. My grandfather said the mountain respects patience, Martinez said. But I think it's more than that. I think the mountain respects people who don't quit when it tells them to. People who look at the impossible thing and say, not yet. Not until I understand it. He paused. That's what she's doing. She's not forcing it. She's understanding it. Nobody responded, but nobody needed to. The words settled into the shelter the way true things settle, not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. 30 seconds, Torres said. Carter's eye was to the scope. The underlying rhythm of the storm shifted barely fractionally the way a pulse shifts before a held breath, and Whitmore felt it in his chest before he understood it in his mind. The lull. Carter, he said, just her name. Not instructions, she didn't need instructions. Just I feel it too. We're here. She fired. One shot, the report, the storm, the silence. And then, and this time there were no 2 seconds of unbearable waiting because Gaines was already watching. And Carter's correction had been built on the data of the first shot, and 9 minutes of intense recalculation and the specific rare accuracy of someone who learns from failure faster than most people learn from success. This time Gaines said it in 4 seconds. Down. Second target is down. Confirmed. And this time the shelter didn't go quiet. This time Torres said something loud and wordless, and Decker hit the stone wall with his fist. And Paulson neck wound, and made a sound like a man who just remembered how to breathe. Ruiz closed his eyes and pressed the back of his head against the stone and stayed there for a long moment. Martinez laughed again, painful and real, and completely uncontrollable, and this time nobody tried to stop him. Whitmore was already at the radio. Gaines, command, now. On it. Gaines's hands were moving fast. Command, this is Alpha Shelter Whitmore. Second target neutralized. Repeat ridge position is clear. Both enemy snipers confirmed down. Eastern approach corridor is safe for extraction. Do you copy? The response came back with less interference than anything had come through in the past 12 hours, as if the storm, having done its part in the story, had decided to let the ending be heard clearly. Copy, Whitmore. Extraction team is moving. ETA 90 minutes. Hold your position. 90 minutes. Whitmore sat down on the stone floor of the shelter and put his back against the wall and looked up at the ceiling and let 90 minutes feel like exactly what it was, a distance he could see from here. Carter was running her post-shot protocols again. Same as before, methodical, precise, the discipline of someone who doesn't change their process based on the outcome. But she was also doing something she hadn't done after the first shot. She was sitting back, slightly on her heels, and she was looking at the rifle with an expression that was, if you watched carefully, if you knew what you were looking at, something close to gratitude. Not pride, not satisfaction. Gratitude. The specific emotion of someone who has been given a very hard problem by the world and has been trusted with the tools to solve it. Ruiz opened his eyes. He looked at Carter for a long moment. Then he stood up from the wall, crossed the shelter, and extended his hand. Carter looked at the hand, then at him. She shook it. Ruiz, he said. Carter, she said. I owe you an apology and a thank you, he said, in that order. You don't owe me anything. I called what you were doing impossible. You called the shot impossible, not me. She held his gaze. There's a difference. The shot was genuinely very close to impossible. You weren't wrong about the difficulty. You were wrong about the ceiling. Ruiz thought about that. The ceiling, he repeated. The thing you were calling impossible was actually just unprecedented. Those are different categories. Impossible means the physics don't allow it. Unprecedented means nobody's documented doing it before. A beat. Physics allows a lot of things nobody's documented yet. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Something was working in his face, the particular expression of a man revising a belief he's held for a long time, which is never a small thing, regardless of how quietly it happens. I'm going to think about that for a while, he said. Take your time, Carter said. Torres had his knees pulled up and his head back and his eyes closed, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man experiencing something he doesn't have language for yet and has decided to just feel it fully until the words arrive later. Which was, Whitmore thought, actually one of the more emotionally intelligent responses in the shelter. Gaines, Whitmore said. Gaines looked at him. When this is over, when the reports are written and the debrief is done and everything is official. Whitmore paused. Make sure Carter's call sign gets into the operational record, not as a support asset, as the shooter. Her name, her shot, her call. Gaines held his gaze. Roger that, Sarge. Because in 10 years, when someone's in a training room somewhere being told that shot doesn't exist, I want there to be a record that says otherwise. Whitmore looked at Carter, with a name attached. Carter looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, but something related to it. The expression of someone who has spent long enough having their work classified and redacted and attributed to operational circumstances, that the simple act of being named feels briefly unfamiliar. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in a way that was quiet and genuine and had nothing performative about it. Thank you, Whitmore said back. Outside, the storm was finally beginning its slow retreat. Not gone, still loud, still cold, still entirely capable of making the next 90 minutes difficult. But the pitch of it had changed. The upper registers were softening. The sustained violence of it was becoming gradually just weather. Just weather. Martinez had his eyes closed and his breathing was slow and controlled, managing the pain in his leg the way he'd been managing it for hours, not eliminating it because there was no eliminating it, but containing it, keeping it in its lane. He was going to need surgery, and he was going to be off duty for months, and he was going to tell this story for the rest of his life. Paulson was asleep. Actually asleep, which was either testament to his physiological resilience or to the particular mercy the body sometimes offers people who have been operating at maximum tension for extended periods. His neck wound was dressed, his rifle was in his lap, and he was asleep with the absolute conviction of someone who has decided the crisis is over and is not going to argue with his own nervous system about it. Decker and the others were talking quietly, the low, fragmented conversation of soldiers who are processing something too large to process all at once, breaking it into small pieces that can be examined one at a time. Ruiz sat down. For the first time since Carter had arrived in the shelter, he sat down in his corner in a way that was not watchful or defensive, but simply resting. The particular rest of a man who has been wrong about something important and has, with some difficulty and genuine honesty, admitted it and moved forward. Carter sat beside her rifle with her notebook in her lap. She wasn't writing anymore. She was looking at the pages she'd already written, the calculations, the corrections, the data from both shots with the particular look of someone cataloging a lesson. Not for praise, not for records, for the next time. Because there would always be a next time, and the next time the problem would be different. And the difference between solving it and not would be whether she'd learned everything the current problem had to teach. 90 minutes to extraction. The ridge was silent. The storm was retreating. And in a half-buried stone-filled shelter in a frozen valley, 10 soldiers who had spent 12 hours on the wrong side of the impossible were sitting with the quiet, specific satisfaction of people who had found the door and walked through it. The mountain had finally allowed it. 73 minutes into the 90-minute wait, the radio said something nobody was ready for. Gaines pulled the headset off so fast it caught on his ear and he had to yank it free. His face had gone to that particular place it went when information arrived that required immediate processing before delivery, the careful construction of words around a fact that was going to land hard regardless of how carefully it was wrapped. "Talk to me," Whitmore said. He was on his feet before Gaines opened his mouth. 15 years of reading rooms told him that whatever was coming was not good news. "Extraction team," Gaines said. "They hit a problem into the corridor. Secondary road collapsed under the vehicle weight, the freeze-thaw cycle weakened the surface, and the lead vehicle broke through. Nobody hurt, but the primary extraction route is blocked." He paused. "They're rerouting to where northern approach." The shelter went absolutely silent. The northern approach meant coming in from the direction of the ridge that was now clear, 2 confirmed kills. No return fire in over an hour, but clear in the way that battlefields are clear after a fight, which is different from safe, which is different from certain. Clear meant the known threats were neutralized. It did not mean the unknown threats were. Torres said it before anyone else could. "They're coming in from the ridge side. Railroad adds 40 minutes to their ETAE, Gaines said. "Command is asking if we have any additional intelligence on the northern corridor." Whitmore looked at Carter. Carter was already at her notebook. Not because she'd been asked, because the moment Gaines said northern approach, her mind had gone there automatically, the way her mind always went directly to the problem, stripping everything else away, looking for the shape of what needed to be solved. "The ridge is clear," she said without looking up. "The 2 positions I engaged are neutralized, but the northern corridor has 2 blind spots. There's a topographical fold about 800 meters north-northwest that I couldn't cover from inside the shelter. If there's a 3rd element up there, that's where it would stage." "Third element," Ruiz said. Not a question. His voice had a particular flatness that meant he was running the same calculation and didn't like the answer. "I don't know that there is one," Carter said carefully. "I'm saying if there is, that's the location." Whitmore made the call in about 4 seconds. "Gaines, tell command we need aerial thermal imaging on the northern corridor, specifically the topographical fold at 800 meters north-northwest of the ridge primary position. We need it before the extraction team enters that corridor. They may not have assets positioned for—" "I know what they may not have. Ask anyway." Gaines was already transmitting. The next 8 minutes were the specific kind of slow that happens when a situation that felt resolved suddenly reveals it isn't. Every person in the shelter who had allowed themselves to begin relaxing, and they all had in their different ways pulled that relaxation back in and put it away and returned to the place they'd been operating from for the past 12 hours. Except it was harder this time. It was harder because they'd tasted the other thing. They'd felt the weight lift and the air change and the specific relief of 2 confirmed kills and a 90-minute countdown to people coming to take them home. Going back to high alert after that was a different kind of effort than sustaining it from the beginning. The body and the mind both knew what relaxation felt like now, and they wanted it back, and denying them was an act of will that cost something real. Martinez felt it. He could see it in the faces around him from his position on the floor. He couldn't do much about his broken leg, but he could do something about the atmosphere, which was starting to tighten in a way that reminded him too much of the first hours in the shelter. "Hey," he said, not loud, just enough to cut through the silence that was becoming too heavy. A few faces turned toward him. "Anybody want to hear something my grandfather used to say about waiting?" "Martinez," Ruiz said with a weariness that was not unkind. "You've told us 3 things your grandfather said since we got in here. He was a smart man. He was apparently a very quotable man." "Those aren't always the same thing," Torres said. "In his case, they were," Martinez said. "He used to say, and this is relevant, I promise he used to say that the hardest part of any hunt isn't finding the animal. It's the moment after you think you've found it, and it turns out you were looking at a shadow." He shifted carefully, managing his leg. "You have to go back to the beginning. And going back to the beginning after you thought you were done, that's where most people give up." The shelter absorbed this. "We're not giving up," Ruiz said. "No," Martinez agreed. "We're not. That's the point." Gaines pulled the headset down. "Command has a drone. Limited thermal capability in this weather, but they're repositioning it now. ETA on imaging, 12 minutes. 12 minutes, Whitmore confirmed. Extraction team, holding at the reroute junction until we clear the corridor. Good. That was the right call. Whitmore hadn't been sure command would hold them. Extraction teams operated on their own momentum, and there was always the pressure to move to act to get to the people who needed extracting. But someone at command had made the right read. A 40-minute delay was better than driving a medical team into an unchecked corridor. Carter had moved to her position at the observation gap again. Not with the rifle. The gap didn't give her a line on the northern corridor, and she knew it. She was watching the ridge anyway, watching for anything. Movement, reflection, the specific quality of wrongness that experienced field operators learned to detect in ways they couldn't always explain. "What are you seeing?" Torres asked her. He'd settled into position near her without making a decision about it. His body just kept going where she was. "Nothing yet," she said. "That's either good or it's just nothing." "How do you tell the difference?" She thought about it for a moment. "You usually can't, not until something happens that tells you which one it was." A pause. "The trick is to stay ready for both interpretations simultaneously." Torres nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, "but it's better than being sure about the wrong thing." Ruiz from across the shelter said, "That's the best description of fieldwork I've heard in 11 years. Carter glanced at him. "I mean it," Ruiz said. "They should put that in the manual. Stay ready for both interpretations simultaneously." He said it with the careful appreciation of a craftsman hearing another craftsman articulate something that had previously lived only in instinct. Whitmore checked his watch. 62 minutes since the second confirmed kill. 109 minutes since Carter had walked through the shelter door. It felt simultaneously much longer and much shorter than that. Time in extreme situations operated by different rules, compressed in the moments of highest intensity, distended in the waiting spaces between. Paulson woke up. He came up from sleep with the particular startle of a soldier whose nervous system doesn't fully stand down, even in rest eyes, open hand-on rifle immediately scanning the shelter for the threat that had woken him. When he confirmed there wasn't one, he settled, looked at the neck wound, dressing he had apparently forgotten about, winced and said, "How long was I out?" "About 40 minutes, Decker said. "What did I miss?" "Extraction route collapsed. Brief behest. They're rerouting through the northern corridor. We're waiting on thermal imaging to clear it." Decker delivered this with the matter-of-fact precision of someone summarizing a meeting. Paulson stared at him. "Of course it did," he said in the voice of a man who has decided that the universe has a sense of humor and has made a personal peace with this fact. "Of course the route collapsed." "It's fine," Torres said. "I know it's fine," Paulson said. "I just want to register officially for the record that this has been the most comprehensively difficult 24 hours of my career, and I would appreciate some cooperation from the physical infrastructure." "Noted," Whitmore said. "Thank you, Sergeant." Despite everything, despite the tension and the 12-minute clock on the drone and the northern corridor sitting unchecked between them and home, something like a laugh moved through the shelter. Quiet, brief, real. Carter actually smiled. A real one this time, not the small, private expression from earlier. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then she was back to the observation gap, but it had been there and Torres saw it and filed it somewhere important. 10 minutes and 40 seconds after Gaines reported the drone repositioning the imaging came through. Gaines went still again. That specific stillness. Whitmore crossed the shelter. He looked at the feed Gaines was interpreting, low resolution fragmented by weather interference. But thermal signatures didn't lie the way visible light did, and the shape on the screen was not ambiguous. One contact, Gaines said, topographical fold north-northwest 800 plus meters. Stationary. Has been stationary for the duration of the imaging window, which is, he checked, 4 minutes. One contact, Whitmore repeated. Stationary, Carter said from the observation gap. Not a question. She'd heard. Stationary, Gaines confirmed. Positioned for the corridor, she said. Again, not a question. Gaines looked at the imaging. Orientation is consistent with the firing position covering the northern approach. The shelter had gone back to the held breath quality of the worst moments. But it was different now. Not the despair-edged tension of being trapped with no options, but the sharp, focused tension of people who know exactly what the problem is and are waiting to find out if they have what it takes to solve it a third time. Ruiz said slowly, 3 shooters. Triangulated positions, Carter said. She was back at her notebook already. Primary ridge, which I engaged. Secondary ridge offset, which I engaged. And a tertiary position at the topographical fold covering the extraction corridor. She looked up. This wasn't random. This was a coordinated denial operation. They were set up to control the entire valley approach system. The ridge controlled interior movement. The fold controls egress. The tactical picture of it, the full shape of what they'd been inside without knowing it, landed on everyone in the shelter at the same time. Not panic, something colder and more clarifying than panic. They planned this, Torres said. Very carefully, Carter said. The two ridge positions kept us contained. The fold position was the insurance if we somehow neutralize the ridge, any extraction attempt through the only viable reroute gets cut off. She closed the notebook. Someone thought this through. Someone is currently lying in the topographical fold thinking they've already won, Whitmore said. Yes. Can you reach it from here? Carter was quiet for 3 full seconds. That was longer than her usual response time, and every person in the shelter registered it. The fold position is at a different elevation and a different azimuth than anything I've engaged today, she said carefully. The valley geometry between this shelter and that position is complex. I need to calculate a completely new firing solution. Different wind profile, different bullet path, different atmospheric interaction. She paused. And the observation gap in this shelter doesn't give me a clean line on that position. What do you need? Whitmore asked. Another pause. Longer. I need to move outside the shelter. The words landed like something physical. Torres said, That's Carter, that means you're exposed. If there's anyone else on that ridge we don't know about. I know. The thermal imaging only covered what the drone could see. There could be Bowman. I know Torres. That's a significant risk to your... I know. Her voice was not sharp. It was the specific gentleness of someone who has already done the risk calculation and reached an answer they don't love, but can accept. I know all of it, and if the extraction team drives into that corridor without this position, neutralize the medics and the drivers and everyone coming to get Martinez and Paulson home are driving into a prepared firing position. She looked at Whitmore. It's the call, Sergeant. Yours. Whitmore looked at her. He thought about every version of this calculation. He ran it fast and thorough the way 15 years of making hard calls in impossible situations had trained him to run it. He thought about Martinez's leg, Paulson's neck, the extraction team in the corridor junction waiting on his word, the drone imaging that showed one stationary contact at the fold, position patient waiting. He thought about the fact that Carter had solved 2 shots today that the entire military doctrine of the last 30 years would have called impossible, and she had done it by understanding the environment in ways that nobody else in this shelter could replicate. He thought about the specific reality that there was no other option. 2 minutes outside, Whitmore said. I want you out, assessed, positioned, and back inside in 2 minutes if the shot isn't viable. And you don't go alone. Ruiz, you cover her the whole time she's out there. Ruiz was already reaching for his rifle. Not a moment of hesitation. Whatever version of Ruiz had spent the early hours of this situation standing in his corner, cataloging reasons. Things wouldn't work. That version was gone. In its place was the version that had been a soldier for 11 years, and that version moved with complete conviction toward the person he'd been assigned to protect. On your 6, Ruiz said to Carter. The whole time. Carter looked at him for a moment. Don't get between me and the fold position. Wouldn't dream of it. Torres said, Sarge, Torres. Whitmore's voice was level. Time them. Torres looked at him, then he looked at Carter, then he nodded. Roger. What happened in the next 90 seconds was the fastest full preparation Whitmore had ever watched Carter execute. She moved through her pre-shot protocol the way someone moves when they've stripped every non-essential second out of the process, not rushing, but with zero waste. Rifle. Corrections. A new page in the notebook that she filled in 40 seconds of calculation that Whitmore couldn't follow, but that had the dense, purposeful quality of work being done correctly at speed. She tore the page out, folded it, put it in her pocket. In case, she said to no one in particular. And then she was at the shelter door, and Ruiz was behind her, and Whitmore was looking at the door as it opened, and the storm, weaker than before but still entirely present, came in with cold and noise. The door closed. 90 seconds, Torres said immediately. The shelter felt different with 2 people gone from it. Smaller somehow, even though 2 people out of 10 was not mathematically significant. It felt like what it was, people outside the protection of the stones in the open in a valley that still had at least one prepared enemy shooter in it. Gaines was at his radio with one hand and the thermal feed with the other. Full contact still stationary, he said. He doesn't know they're out there. Yet, Decker said. Yet, Gaines agreed. 60 seconds, Torres said. Martinez had his eyes open and fixed on the door. He wasn't talking about his grandfather. He wasn't talking at all. He was just watching the door and breathing in the careful, controlled way he'd been breathing all day, managing what needed to be managed. Paulson had his rifle up, not pointed at anything, just up. Ready. The neck wound was a secondary concern now. 45 seconds, Torres said. Whitmore was at the observation gap. He couldn't see Carter or Ruiz from this angle. They'd moved north of the shelter's sight line to find the angle on the fold, but he could see the ridge, still silent, still nothing moving on it. The 2 positions he knew about were neutralized. The ones he didn't know about were the ones keeping his jaw tight. 30 seconds, Torres said, and then Gaines said sharply, full contact is moving. Moving how? Whitmore spun from the gap. Repositioning? Gaines pressed the headset hard. He's shifting east. Maybe he caught movement from Carter and Ruiz going out. Maybe he's just adjusting, but he's not stationary anymore. Get Carter on comms, now. Trying, Gaines was transmitting. Carter, this is Gaines. Fold contact is mobile. Do you copy static? The storm and the jamming doing their work. Carter, this is Gaines. Fold contact is repositioning east. Do you copy? 15 seconds, Torres said, and his voice had climbed a register. Static. And then Carter's voice compressed and slightly broken by interference, but absolutely clear in its essential quality. Unhurried, present, working the problem. Copy, Gaines. I have visual on the fold. He's moving, but he's moving into a worse position for himself. He's exposed now. Give me 45 seconds. She's asking for 45 past the 2-minute mark, Torres said, immediately looking at Whitmore. Whitmore didn't hesitate. Give it to her. Roger, Torres reset. 45 seconds. Mark. The shelter ran through those 45 seconds the way it ran through every high-stakes interval, in complete, absolute committed silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who understand that the next sound they hear is going to tell them something definitive. 20 seconds. Gaines, he's still moving, slower now. He's settling into the eastern exposure. 10 seconds. Torres, 10, 5, and the shot came through the shelter door, muffled by the storm, reduced by distance, but unmistakable. 1 shot. Gaines had the thermal feed. He watched it. His hands were very still. His eyes were moving across the screen. 4 seconds. 5, 6. Contact is down, Gaines said. Full position is clear. Nobody screamed this time. Nobody hit a wall. What happened in that shelter in the second after Gaines said those words was something quieter and deeper than celebration. It was the particular silence of people who have been pushed to the absolute limit of what they thought they were capable of and have discovered with something like wonder that the limit was further out than they knew. Torres sat down on the floor, just sat down right where he was standing, like his legs made a unilateral decision. He sat on the cold stone floor and put his hands on his knees and looked at them. Martinez said, there it is. Just that. There it is. The shelter door opened. Carter and Ruiz came back inside. The storm came with them briefly, and then the door closed, and the relative warmth of 10 people in a stone space returned. Ruiz looked at the room. The room looked at Ruiz. She had the angle in 40 seconds, Ruiz said. 40 seconds from the time she found the position. I've never seen anything like it. He said it with the simple directness of a man making a factual statement. No embellishment, just the fact. Carter set the rifle against the wall. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Whitmore and she said, corridor is clear, all 3 positions neutralized. Whitmore looked at her for a moment. He thought about everything he wanted to say, everything the situation seemed to call for the words that the occasion might have warranted. He had never been a man who said too much when a little was enough. Good work, he said. 2 words. But he said them the way they needed to be said, with the full weight of everything they contained. Carter heard it. He could tell by the way she received it. Gaines was already transmitting. Command, this is Alpha Shelter. All three hostile positions confirmed neutralized. Northern corridor is clear. Extraction team is clear to proceed. The response came back clean and fast. Copy Alpha. Extraction team is moving. ETA 40 minutes. Hold position. 40 minutes. Whitmore said it to the room. 40 minutes. And this time when he said it, it felt like what it was. Not another interval of waiting and hoping. A countdown to something real. Something that had been earned. Torres looked up from his hands on the floor. 40 minutes, he repeated. A smile started somewhere in his face and spread slowly like it was making sure it was welcome before it took up the full space. 40 minutes. Paulson lowered his rifle. I'm going to eat the largest meal of my life when we get back. You say that every deployment, Decker said. And every deployment, I mean it more than the last time. The banter moved through the shelter like something alive, real and loose and human. The specific sound of people who have been tightly wound for a very long time beginning the process of unwinding. Ruiz sat down on the stone floor near Carter. Not dramatically. He just sat down near her, which was its own kind of statement about how the last several hours had changed the geometry between them. 3 shots, he said. 3 shots, she confirmed. 3 completely different firing problems. Different azimuth, different elevation, different atmospheric profile each time. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. I need to understand something. After the first shot missed and the counterfire came in and Paulson got hit. Most people in that situation, the doubt would have gotten in. The noise in the head. How did you not let it in? Carter thought about it. She was someone who took questions seriously, which meant she actually thought before she answered them. It got in, she said finally. Ruiz looked at her. The doubt got in. After the first shot, sitting there writing in the notebook, running the recalculation, the doubt was there. The voice that says, maybe the variables are too many and the window too short and the math too uncertain. She paused. But I've been in enough of those moments to know that the doubt is loudest right before the solution clarifies. It's like your mind makes the most noise right before it finds what it's looking for. So I've learned to hear the doubt and keep writing. Ruiz absorbed this slowly. Hear the doubt and keep writing, he said. The doubt doesn't mean you're wrong, it means you're honest about the difficulty. She looked at him directly. You were doing the same thing, by the way. Every time you named a reason it wouldn't work, you were being honest about the difficulty. You just hadn't decided yet whether difficulty was a reason to stop or a reason to focus. Ruiz held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his face worked through something complicated. Then he said quietly, that's going to rearrange some things for me. Good, Carter said, and she meant it. Martinez had been listening to all of it from the floor. When Carter finished speaking, he said, my grandfather would have said that in about 14 words and then gone back to skinning his deer. What 14 words? Torres asked. Martinez thought about it. Something like, the voice that says you can't is always loudest when you almost can. Et pas, docteur. That's 12 words, Decker said. He was economical, Martinez said. The laughter that came this time was full and real and lasted longer than any of the previous ones. Even Carter laughed a real laugh, brief and genuine, that surprised her slightly by its own arrival. Whitmore stood in the center of his people and listened to them laugh and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. 38 minutes to extraction. Outside, the storm had dropped another register. The valley was still cold and still difficult and would be in all likelihood for days or weeks or the rest of the winter. The ridge was silent. The fold was silent. 3 positions, 3 shots, 3 problems that doctrine said had no solutions. And here they were. Gaines kept his headset on and his eyes on his instruments. Professional until the last. But Whitmore noticed that his right hand, the one not holding equipment, was resting flat on his knee in a way that was for Gaines the equivalent of dancing. It was over. Not finished, not officially, not procedurally, not in the sense of reports and debriefs and the long institutional process of digesting what had happened here. But over in the way that mattered most, the threat was gone, the team was alive, and in 38 minutes, people were coming to take them home. Carter was in her corner with her notebook open again. Writing, not calculations this time, something different. Longer sentences, more deliberate. The kind of writing that is not solving a problem, but recording one that has been solved for reasons that matter beyond this room and beyond this valley and beyond today. Whitmore didn't ask her what she was writing. He already knew. She was writing the thing that the official report wouldn't include. The doubt in the shelter. The laughter before the shots. The moment everyone stopped believing and the silence after the impossible became real. She was writing it down so it would exist somewhere. So that someday, somewhere, someone would read it and understand that the shot was not the miracle. The shot was the result. The miracle, if it deserved that word, was the decision to keep solving when the problem said stop. The extraction team arrived 36 minutes later, not 40, because the team leader had pushed the vehicles harder than the conditions strictly recommended, and nobody in those vehicles had complained about it. The shelter door opened and cold came in first the way it always did, and then came people, medics and drivers, and 2 additional soldiers who fanned out immediately to secure the perimeter, with the practiced efficiency of people who had been briefed on the situation and understood that briefed and arrived are 2 different states of readiness. The medics went straight to Martinez and Paulson without being directed because medics always know where the injuries are before anyone tells them. The one who reached Martinez first crouched beside him, looked at the splint, looked at his face and said, "How long you eat? 14 hours, give or take," Martinez said. "You managed this for 14 hours. I had good company." The medic looked around the shelter briefly at the 10 soldiers, at the rifle case against the wall, at the stone in the cold and the general evidence of a very long and very difficult night, and then looked back at Martinez. "Let's get you out of here." "That," Martinez said, "is the best thing anyone has said to me in 14 hours. Whitmore stood at the shelter door and watched his people move. Watched Torres help guide the stretcher they'd brought in for Martinez, talking to him the whole time in the low, continuous way that young soldiers talk to injured ones, not saying anything essential, just keeping the connection. Watched Paulson walk out under his own power with a medic at his elbow and his rifle still in his hand, because Paulson was not the kind of man who let someone else carry his rifle, even when his neck was wrapped in field dressing. Watched Decker and the others file out into the cold with a particular movement of people who have been in one place too long and are now in motion and are not going to stop for anything. Ruiz came to stand beside Whitmore at the door. "You good?" Whitmore asked. "Better than I've been in 14 hours, Ruiz said. A pause, long, which is a low bar, but I'll take it. "Yeah." Whitmore watched the valley for a moment. The ridge, silent, final. "You know what the strangest part is? What? I kept waiting for something else to go wrong. 3 positions we didn't know about. I kept thinking there had to be a 4th, a 5th. Some other thing the math hadn't accounted for." Ruiz was quiet for a moment. "But there wasn't." "No, there wasn't," Whitmore exhaled slowly. "Sometimes the impossible thing is just the impossible thing, and when it's done, it's done." Carter came through the shelter last. She had her rifle case in one hand and her notebook in her jacket pocket, and she stopped at the door for exactly 2 seconds, not looking back, not being sentimental about it, just pausing in the way that people pause in doorways when they're making the full transition from one state to another. Then she walked out. The convoy moved north through the storm corridor, with the extraction team's lead vehicle setting a pace that was fast without being reckless, and the sheltered valley fell behind them 1 kilometer at a time. The vehicle Whitmore was in held 6 people himself: Carter, Torres, Ruiz Gaines, and one of the extraction team drivers who had the particular quality of silence that meant he'd been doing this long enough to know that the people he was transporting needed the quiet more than they needed conversation. For the first 10 minutes, nobody spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much and none of it had resolved itself into words yet. It was still in the body in the specific physical weight that settles into muscles after they've been held tense for too many hours, in the particular heaviness behind the eyes and the strange lightness that coexists with the weight when something terrible finally stops being present tense. Torres was the one who broke it, because Torres was always the one who broke it because he was 22, and his internal pressure valve operated faster than the older soldiers around him. "And I keep thinking about the first shot," he said, not to anyone specific, just into the vehicle's quiet. "The first one that missed. I keep thinking about what it felt like in the shelter. After. The way the room just went somewhere bad. Nobody told him to stop." And then I think about the way she just sat there and wrote in the notebook, while everyone was thinking it was over. While Ruiz was, he caught himself and glanced at Ruiz. Ruiz didn't flinch. While I was being wrong about something important, he said, you can say it. While the room was falling apart, Torres continued, she was just writing, like the failure was information and not a verdict. He paused. I've never seen anyone do that before. Treat a miss like data instead of a disaster. It's a discipline, Carter said. Her voice was quiet in the vehicle. It's not a natural response. Nobody's natural response to a miss under those conditions is calm analysis. The natural response is what everyone else was having. The discipline is training yourself out of the natural response and into the useful one. How long did it take you to train yourself into it? Torres asked. Carter thought about it honestly. Long enough that I made a lot of expensive mistakes along the way, she said. But the basic principle, the idea that failure is information, I got that early. From my father, actually. He was a mechanic. He used to say that a car that breaks down is just showing you where it needs attention. The breakdown isn't the problem. The breakdown is the diagnosis. Ruiz said, your father was a mechanic and you became a long-range sniper. He was also a hunter. Montana winter hunting extended ranges, difficult conditions. A slight pause. He taught me the patience. The Army taught me the math. I put them together. The vehicle hit a rough patch in the road and everyone shifted and settled, and the driver made a small correction without comment. Whitmore was watching Carter from across the vehicle. Not intrusively, just the way a commander watches someone who has performed at an extraordinary level and is now sitting in the aftermath of it, and he was trying to read what the aftermath looked like for her. What it looked like, he decided, was tired. Genuinely tired in the way that deep effort produces not the ragged exhaustion of someone who barely survived, but the clean, settled fatigue of someone who spent everything they had on the right thing and has no regrets about the expenditure. Can I ask you something? Whitmore said. Carter looked at him. Command classified your designation. The whole engagement is going to be classified most likely. Maybe all of it, Gut. He paused. Does that bother you? She considered the question for a long moment. The vehicle moved through the corridor and the storm pressed against the windows, and outside was still cold and dark and indifferent. No, she said finally. The classification is about the capability. They don't want adversaries knowing what's possible at that range in those conditions. That makes operational sense. A pause. What would bother me is if the classification was about the person instead of the capability. If someone decided that the shot should be attributed to different circumstances because a woman taking it was inconvenient for someone's model of what's possible, is that what you're expecting to happen? I'm expecting the report to be accurate, she said. Whitmore, you told Gaines to make sure my name was attached to the operational record. That matters. She held his gaze. That's the thing that changes the next version of this conversation. Not the classification, the record. Whitmore nodded slowly. Then the record will be accurate. Good. Gaines, who had been almost entirely silent since the extraction, spoke from his corner of the vehicle. For what it's worth, I wrote the initial transmission myself. Name, rank, confirmed engagements, distances, conditions. All 3 shots. Attribution is Carter Emily Staff Sergeant before command had a chance to decide otherwise. He said it with the flat professional certainty of someone who has done the right bureaucratic thing at exactly the right moment and knows it. It's already in the system. Carter looked at him. Gaines met her look without expression. You can thank me by never telling anyone I did something sentimental. It's not sentimental, Carter said. It's accurate. In this institution, Gaines said, those are sometimes the same thing. The convoy reached the staging base 2 hours and 11 minutes after leaving the shelter. The base was warm and lit and full of the particular organized motion of a military installation that has been notified that casualties are incoming medics, stage documentation ready, the careful machinery of institutional care preparing to receive people who needed it. Martinez went straight to the medical facility with the focused efficiency of people who had been watching his vitals for 2 hours in a freezing vehicle and had specific opinions about how quickly he needed surgery. He managed in transit to say something to each member of the unit within earshot. Whitmore didn't catch most of it. He caught the last part addressed to Carter, who was walking alongside the stretcher for the last few meters. My grandfather would have wanted to hear that story, Martinez said. Every detail. Maybe you'll tell it for him, Carter said. Every chance I get, Martinez said. And then the medical team had him and the doors closed, and he was in their hands now, which was where he needed to be. Paulson stopped before he went through the medical facility doors. He turned around and found Carter and the group behind him. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has a lot of words available and is selecting the right ones carefully. I was asleep when the second shot happened, he said. I know. And the third? I know. So I missed 2 out of 3. He shook his head slowly. 14 years in the Army, and I slept through the most remarkable thing I've ever been in proximity to. He paused. I'm going to be telling people about this for the rest of my life, and I was unconscious for most of it. You were there for the first one, Carter said. I was there for the miss. You were there for the data, she said. The miss is what made the other 2 possible. You were part of it. Paulson looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You're a very unusual person, Staff Sergeant. I've been told, she said. He nodded once, the deep and genuine nod of a man settling a debt of gratitude, and then he went through the medical doors. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that the previous 14 hours had been dramatic. It was the drama of paperwork and debriefs and hot food and the long, strange process of returning to ordinary conditions after extraordinary ones. Whitmore sat through 3 hours of debrief with 2 intelligence officers who asked detailed questions about the engagement and wrote everything down with the careful, methodical attention of people who understood they were recording something significant. He answered every question completely and accurately. When they reached Carter's role in the engagement, he was precise and unambiguous. 3 confirmed long-range kills, distances exceeding 1,600 meters, blizzard conditions, sub-zero temperatures, visibility under 200 meters, single correction between shots 1 and 2, immediate recalculation and engagement of secondary target, third target acquired and neutralized from exterior position under direct personal risk. All 3 shots confirmed by independent observation. The senior intelligence officer wrote all of it, then looked up. Staff Sergeant Carter's designation is classified. The designation is classified, Whitmore said. The record of the engagement is not. A pause. The record, the officer said carefully, will reflect the confirmed operational outcomes. With attribution, Whitmore said, not a question, not a request. The officer looked at him for a moment, then wrote something. With attribution, he confirmed. Whitmore nodded. He was done. The debrief room where Carter was being questioned was down the corridor. Whitmore didn't go to it. She didn't need him there, and it wasn't his place. But Ruiz was in the corridor when Whitmore came out, sitting in one of the hard plastic chairs that military installations put in corridors, as if they expect people to be comfortable in them, which nobody ever is. You've been sitting here the whole time, Whitmore said. 40 minutes, Ruiz said, give or take. Why, how? Ruiz looked at the debrief room door, making sure they're not doing anything with the record that needs to be corrected. Whitmore sat down in the chair beside him. 2 soldiers in the corridor of a military base, both tired, both still running a little hot from the previous 14 hours, both watching a closed door for reasons that neither of them would have been able to fully articulate to someone who hadn't been in that shelter. You know you can't actually do anything if they decide to handle the record a certain way, Whitmore said. I know, Ruiz said. I'm here anyway. They sat in silence for a while. The corridor had people moving through it, base personnel going about the ordinary business of an installation, people who had not been in a frozen valley for 14 hours and were not currently processing 3 impossible shots in the specific emotional aftermath of being wrong about what was possible. I've been thinking about what she said in the vehicle, Ruiz said after a while, about the discipline, training yourself out of the natural response and into the useful one. Yeah, I think I've been doing the opposite, Ruiz said, for a while now, calling things impossible before I've fully worked the problem. Not because I actually believe they're impossible, but because, he stopped. Because if you call it impossible first, the failure doesn't cost you as much, Whitmore said. Ruiz looked at him. You knew that? I've been watching you do it for 2 years. Why didn't you say anything? Because you're excellent at everything you actually commit to, and the thing you were protecting yourself from wasn't costing the mission. Whitmore paused. Until today. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Until today, he agreed. The debrief room door opened. Carter came out with the particular posture of someone who has been asked many questions and has answered them all correctly and is now ready to stop being asked questions for a while. She saw Whitmore and Ruiz in the chairs and she stopped. "You've been out here this whole time," she said. Not quite a question. Ruiz was concerned about the record, Whitmore said. Carter looked at Ruiz. "The record is accurate," she said. "The senior officer in there is thorough, and he takes attribution seriously. It's documented the right way." She paused. "All 3 shots." Ruiz exhaled. Something released in him that he'd been holding since the debrief started. "Good," he said. Carter sat down in the chair on Ruiz's other side. 3 soldiers in a corridor in plastic chairs, 14 hours past the worst of it in the particular shared exhaustion that only comes from going through something extreme together and surviving it. "Torres is looking for you," Carter said to Whitmore. "He's in the mess hall. He apparently found real coffee and is treating it like a religious experience." "Torres treats most things like religious experiences," Whitmore said. "Today he's earned it." A pause. "All of you have," Carter said quietly. Ruiz looked at her. "That's generous considering we spent the first several hours of your arrival collectively doubting everything you were doing. You were doing what experienced soldiers do when someone tells them the impossible is possible," Carter said. "You were protecting your people from false hope. That's not nothing." She looked at him directly. "The moment you committed, you were fully in. That's what matters." Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that cost him something real to say, because Ruiz was not a man who spent his vulnerability freely. "I've been a sniper for 11 years, he said. "I'm good. I know I'm good. But what I watched you do today, 3 different firing problems, 3 completely different solutions under conditions that I would have called unsurvivable for precision engagement. I need you to know that I understand now what I didn't understand this morning. There's a ceiling I had in my head about what's achievable at distance, and you didn't just push against it. You walked through it like it wasn't there." Carter received this carefully. She understood that it was not praise looking for a response. It was a man revising something fundamental about his understanding of his own craft, and saying so out loud, which was the harder part. "The ceiling is real for most conditions," she said. "What I do isn't replicable in standard conditions because the training and the specific environmental reading takes years to develop. I'm not saying the ceiling doesn't exist. I'm saying I've spent a long time finding where it actually is rather than where people assume it is." She paused. "Those are very different locations." Ruiz nodded slowly. "I'm going to think about that for a long time." "Good," Carter said. "That's the right response." They sat in the corridor for another few minutes before anyone moved. Not because there was nothing to do, there was plenty to do. Debrief notes to review, reports to sign, food to eat, sleep to find. But none of those things required them to move this exact second, and so they sat. Then the moment that no one expected arrived. Whitmore's radio crackled, the one clip to his jacket, the base frequency, not the field unit. The voice that came through it belonged to Colonel Henley, who had been the voice at the other end of the transmission in the shelter that felt like a lifetime ago, when he'd said, "Carter is your fire support," in a tone that had made every soldier in the shelter rearrange their expectations. "Whitmore, my office, 30 minutes. Whitmore looked at his radio. "Sir, bring Carter." A pause. "Sir, you heard me, 30 minutes. The radio went silent. Ruiz looked at Carter. Carter looked at Whitmore. Something moved through the corridor, not alarm exactly, but the particular attentiveness of people who recognize that the next thing that happens is going to matter. "What does he want?" Carter said. Her voice was level, but her eyes were working. "I don't know," Whitmore said honestly. "But Henley doesn't call people to his office to tell them something went wrong. He does that in the debrief room with the intelligence officers." He stood. "Let's go find out." Colonel Henley's office was the office of a man who had been in enough places to have accumulated enough things that told the story of those places, not cluttered, but full in the way that a life fully lived is full. He was standing when they came in, which meant the meeting was not going to be long. Commanders who stand for meetings have already decided what they're going to say. He looked at Carter first, then at Whitmore. Then he said without preamble, 3 confirmed engagements, extreme distance, blizzard conditions, single correction between first and second shot, Immediate adaptation to third target under direct personal risk. He paused. That's a summary of what's in the record. That's accurate, Carter said. It's also unprecedented, Henley said. Not in the sense that long-range extreme condition engagements haven't been attempted before. In the sense that three different firing problems with the accuracy you produced that hasn't been documented. Carter said nothing. I'm not going to stand here and tell you what you already know, Henley said. What I'm going to tell you is that the record stands. All 3 shots, full attribution, your name on every one. That's not a question and it's not a negotiation. The record is what it is because it's accurate and because in this office we don't adjust accurate records for the convenience of people who find the accuracy uncomfortable. Something shifted in Carter's face. Small, controlled, but real. Thank you, sir, she said. Don't thank me for accuracy, Henley said. That's a low bar. He looked at Whitmore. Your team performed well in conditions that would have broken a less cohesive unit. That goes in the record too. He paused. Martinez is out of surgery. Leg will heal. Paulson is going to have a scar that he'll be insufferably proud of for the rest of his career. That sounds right, Whitmore said. Get your people fed and rested. The full debrief is in 72 hours. Henley looked at Carter one more time. Something moved across his face that was not quite sentimental, but was in the neighborhood of it, the particular expression of a senior officer who has in a long career seen extraordinary things and has just added one more to the list. Carter. Sir, the instruction we give advanced sniper candidates, the one about effective range ceilings in adverse conditions. He paused. I'm going to have to revise it. Carter met his gaze steadily. I'd suggest replacing the ceiling with a framework, she said. Not a fixed limit, a set of variables that determine where the limit actually sits in specific conditions. The ceiling moves. It's not gone, but its location is situational. Henley looked at her for a long moment. Write that up for me. Yes, sir. He nodded once, dismissed. They came back out into the corridor and Ruiz was still there, which was either a testament to his patience or to his investment in knowing what had just happened. He looked at their faces and read them with the accuracy of someone who had been reading rooms professionally for over a decade. Good, he said. Good, Whitmore said. Ruiz nodded and stood. Then I'm going to find Torres and his coffee before it's gone. They found the whole unit in the mess hall 30 minutes later. Torres had in fact found real coffee and was on a second cup and had the particular brightnesses of someone who has been running on adrenaline and cold for 14 hours and has just discovered caffeine again. Martinez was post-surgery and sedated and would be joining them tomorrow. Paulson was in the mess hall against medical advice neck dressing visible above his collar, claiming the food was medically necessary and that his doctor had said so, which nobody believed but nobody challenged. Decker had taken over the table in the corner and was eating with the focused determination of a man making up a caloric deficit in real time. The others were scattered around in various states of food and exhaustion and the quiet, incomplete conversation of people processing something too big to finish processing in one sitting. When Carter walked in, the table went quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of 12 hours ago. Not the doubt-heavy, tension-loaded silence of the shelter. This was something else. Something that was the sound of people recognizing a specific thing and not quite having the language for it, so saying nothing while the recognition did its work. Torres broke it the way Torres broke things. There she is, he said, just that. 3 words the way you say them when the words are standing in for a great deal more than 3 words can hold. Carter sat down at the table. She took the coffee that Torres pushed toward her without being asked. She looked around at the faces of people who had spent 14 hours in a stone shelter, in a blizzard doubting her, and had come out the other side, unable to doubt anything about her anymore. How's the coffee? She said. Life-changing, Torres said. It's coffee, Ruiz said. Today everything is life-changing, Torres said. I'm allowed. Ruiz looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his own cup. Yeah, he said. Okay, you're allowed. The conversation that happened at that table over the next hour was not dramatic. It was the conversation that happens when extreme pressure releases and people can finally say the things that the pressure kept compressed, the small human things, the observations and confessions and jokes that had been waiting for a room that felt safe enough to hold them. Torres talked about his grandmother who had taught him to tell timing by the sound of weather, and how Carter's reading of the storm's rhythm had reminded him of that. Decker talked about the moment after the first shot missed and how he'd looked at his cards and thought about putting them away because they suddenly seemed frivolous, and then decided not to because the frivolity was the point. Paulson talked about waking up and being told the route had collapsed and feeling the particular dark humor of a universe that was clearly comprehensively not interested in making anything easy and deciding to find that funny because the alternative was worse. Ruiz talked briefly and without his usual guardedness about why he'd stood in the corridor outside the debrief room. He said he wasn't sure he could have done anything if the record had come out wrong, but that he needed to be there anyway. That being there was the thing. Whitmore listened to all of it. He didn't talk much. He was a man who processed in quiet, and this was one of those times when the processing needed the quiet more than it needed to be spoken. Carter talked about Montana, about her father in the garage with engines spread across the floor like the components of a problem waiting to be reassembled, about learning to shoot in conditions that had seemed extreme until today, about the specific thing that happened when you stopped treating the impossible as a closed door and started treating it as a door you hadn't found the key to yet. At some point in the second hour, Gaines arrived. He sat down, took the coffee Torres offered, and said, "Martinez is awake. He says to tell everyone that his grandfather would have approved of the whole thing and he's sorry he missed dinner." "He was there for the important parts," Carter said. "I told him that," Gaines said. "He said you'd say that." The mess hall thinned out as people found their way to rest. One by one and two by two until it was just Whitmore and Carter at the table with the last of the coffee and the quiet of a late hour on a base where most people were asleep. Whitmore said, "What do you write in the notebook, Carter? Not the calculations. The other part." Carter looked at him. "How did you know there was another part?" "I watched you writing in the vehicle. It wasn't calculations. Different quality of attention." She considered whether to answer. Then she said, "I write what the reports leave out. The texture of it, what it actually felt like inside the problem, the doubt, the recalculation, the specific quality of the window when it opened." She paused. "Because in 5 years or 10 years, someone is going to face a problem that looks like the one I face today, and they're going to be told it's impossible. And the only thing that might help them is knowing that someone sat in a cold shelter with everyone around them waiting for her to fail and kept writing in the notebook anyway." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. "And she solved it," he said. "And she solved it," Carter said. The base was quiet around them. The storm was finished somewhere above the valley they'd left behind. The ridge was silent, the way ridges are silent when the people who were on them are no longer there. The valley would be there tomorrow and the day after, and for years and decades beyond anyone in this story, and different and cold and shaped by forces that had nothing to do with what had happened inside it today. But what had happened inside it today was real. It was in the record in 3 confirmed engagements with full attribution in the notebook in Carter's jacket pocket, in the specific and permanent change that had occurred in the way 11 soldiers understood what was possible when someone refused to accept that impossible was the final answer. Whitmore gathered his things, stood, looked at Carter one last time. "Get some rest," he said. "You too, Sergeant." He walked out. Carter sat alone at the table for a moment. She took out the notebook, opened it to the page she'd been writing in the vehicle. Read what was there, then added one line at the bottom because the story needed its final sentence, and she was the only one who could write it. She wrote, "The mountain showed me the door. I walked through it. That is all it ever was." She closed the notebook, put it away, and for the first time in 22 hours, Emily Carter let herself be still. Not the controlled, deliberate stillness of a shooter managing her own physiology for precision, but the simple, complete stillness of a person who gave everything the problem required and has nothing left to prove to anyone, including herself. Outside, the storm was gone. The valley was quiet. The ridge stood in the dark exactly as it had always stood, indifferent to belief, indifferent to doubt, indifferent to everything except the one truth that the mountain had always known, and that one woman from Montana had proven in 3 shots across a frozen valley to everyone who needed to hear it. Distance was never protection. It was only a problem waiting for the right person to solve it.